Hey, Cypher here, and today I thought I would do a book review. Something that I talked about a little while ago, but haven't gotten around to doing. So, today I thought I would start the whole series with a book that I'm rather fond of. Ned Blackhawk's Violence Over the Land. This book, as the subtitle goes, is about Indians and empires in the early American West, specifically how violence spread because of the interaction of Indians and empires. Now, I really like this book because it gives a particular view of violence which is really useful even if you don't study the Intermountain West. Now, Ned Blackhawk is a Yale professor who was a Shoshone who grew up in Detroit. He went to McGill in Quebec for his undergrad, then UCLA for his master's, and got his PhD from the University of Washington in 1999. As a member of the Shoshone tribe himself, obviously a lot of his personal history colors the pages of this book, which was developed from his dissertation. In this book, he looks at three major tribes in the Intermountain West, specifically the Paiutes, the Shoshones, and the Utes. Much like one of his major influences, he develops a strain of violence that shows that violence is a form of change happening to these tribes, that change being incoming European powers. So from the beginning of the book, we see this undulating power dynamic where Utes, who were the first to come into contact with the Spanish, adapt to new technology like horses and start raiding in order to establish their power, either raiding New Mexico or raiding the neighboring Paiutes, who they make into slaves. Power spreads from the New Mexico colony into neighboring tribes by way of Utes exporting their violence to other tribes. In the beginning of this, you can think of violence as spreading from New Mexico by way of the Utes, who have to fight New Mexicans and then end up fighting the uncontacted Shoshones and Paiutes, as well later on as the Comanches, because the Utes and the Comanches initially were allies, and then they split. So through slave raids and whatnot, the Utes continued to pass on violence to these other people, and eventually started raiding as far afield as California. And then the Americans come in, who, after the Mexican-American War, inherit the problems of New Mexico, including the Utes, who quickly end up getting into a war with the Mormons. As new people come to conquer this space, Utes have to fight back, but in the process, they gain a lot of their power by exporting their violence onto neighboring tribes. And then California starts spreading out, and then the violence spreads eastward. So you have this compressive dynamic between New Mexico and California where violence is constantly pushing into the Intermountain West. Eventually, America is able to come in and disrupt this violence with its own violence by suppression. But because there was so much violence constantly going on through slave raiding, minor wars, and almost genocidal action, the Shoshone in particular were hurt seriously for generations, and one could argue that they still have yet to recover. And the Shoshone were used as an illustrative case for how deplorable the conditions of Indians were. In fact, even the rather forward-looking Mark Twain, or Samuel Clemens as he was actually named, called them by the pejorative term digger. And yes, that is just as pejorative as replacing that D with an N. But that terminology was used specifically to say that the Shoshone were unable to take care of themselves, despite them having to recover from all of this violence. So they weren't given immediate reservations or anything along those lines. It was so bad that this fairly unknown figure came from this tribe called Wovoka. This guy created the ghost dance, which spread like wildfire, and eventually was used as the inciting incident for the wholesale slaughter of a bunch of Lakota Indians. Yes, the depredations against Shoshones 25 years prior, had caused the wholesale slaughter at Wounded Knee 1,000 miles away. But Blackhawk interestingly takes this a step further and digs into his family's history, because he had a grandma who had some troubles, and he uses this exploration of violence as a way of explaining how violence perpetuates itself through the generations. So it's a really powerful book, but of course, it's not without its faults. Firstly, I can't really find a thesis, and every good history book needs a fairly easily defined thesis. There are a few sentences in which I could think of as a thesis, but it's not very clear. Basically, a thesis needs to explain what the entire book is about in about one sentence. An easy way of summarizing basically the entire argument that the book is making. Here are a couple possibilities for what his thesis is. He says, violence provides the threads that weave Great Basin Indian history together and organize the discussion in the following 4 ways. First, the earliest moment of post-contact Great Basin history becomes accessible only through analysis of the shifting relations that remade the Intermountain West during the Spanish colonial era. Then the second one, the shifting relations of violence that remade native worlds throughout the early West did so largely outside of colonial settlements and the purview of authorities. Third, violence weds the history of these native groups to larger imperial histories. And finally, violence and the history of native influences on the imperial and national borderlands require alternate paradigms for understanding the 19th century processes of American expansion. So basically he's saying that he's studying violence, but he doesn't really explain that he's studying violence as a wave of change. But you know, sometimes people just have a way of writing, and honestly, the intro is kind of the weakest part of the entire book. And while he's saying that violence is a wave, he does tend to fall into the problem of basically blaming everything on Europeans, even when it is violence being perpetrated by Indians against another Indian tribe. For instance, he says, Utes, in short, precipitated radical change in the lifeways of Indian peoples, well before their lands became sites of direct colonial encounters, as the violence of Spanish colonialism became further displaced throughout the colonial era. But that's only if you read into it a little bit much, but of course, I'm a historian, that's what I do. He also often tends to shift his focus to one particular tribe or another. For instance, he basically moves from the Utes to the Paiutes to the Shoshone, and kind of disregards the tribes that he was previously talking about after he moves on to the other tribe. Especially the Paiutes are fairly underrepresented in this book. But this changing of focus makes it so that he also tends to kind of skip time frames to the point that there are points in this where a paragraph is used to summarize an entire decade. Especially towards the end, it seems like he was rushing to push this thing out. So there's a few points where you're kind of going like, what was happening in the 1870s? I didn't hear anything about that. Sure got a lot about the 1880s and 1860s, but nothing about the 1870s. But truly, there has never been a history book in which I didn't find some sort of flaw. And while these are flaws, certainly, they're very minor. And I really like this book. This is one of my favorite books. In fact, I've read it about 3 times, 3 or 4, depending on how you count it. And this is the story of a side of the West that we really don't get to hear about. First of all, it's from an Indian perspective, and secondly, it's about tribes that we hardly ever hear about, especially since no one makes movies about Utes, Shoshones, or Paiutes. Yet they were some of the last tribes to be fully conquered. After all, Nevada, where the Paiutes and Shoshones were primarily, was fairly underpopulated and kind of is to this day. But especially if you want to learn more about the Intermountain West, or if you've never heard of things like the Wakara War or the Bear River Massacre, which by the way was one of the worst massacres that the US perpetrated during this period and we almost never hear about it, then you should definitely go and check out this book. It's a very good read and it's only 300 pages, so I'll leave a link in the description. And while you're down there, be sure to tell me what you think of this series, if I should continue doing more book reviews. And I'll see you next time. Now, Ned Blackhawk is a Yale professor who... Shoshone? Now, Ned Blackhawk... Now, Ned Blackhawk is a Yale professor who was a Shoshone who grew up in Detroit. Now, Ned Blackhawk is a Yale professor. Good lord, why can't I even... I can't even screw up my lines correctly. Good lord.